Welcome to Decode Dune, an exegesis of the Dune universe.
Okay, welcome to Decode Dune. We're back and we're very excited for today. This is one of our bonus episodes. We get into stuff like the martial arts aspect of things, the historical aspect of things, some of the linguistics, etc. So today we have a guest. His name is Tim Cartmell. You've probably heard of him if you're in the martial arts world, but just going from his Wikipedia page, he's a martial artist known for being an author and translator of many martial arts books. He's an 8th degree black belt or a master in Kung Fu Sansu and a black belt in BJJ. He placed first at the 2003 IBJJF Pan Championship as a brown belt and first at the 2004 IBJJF Pan Championship as a black belt. Some of his publications include Principles, Analysis, and Applications of Effortless Combat Throws, a detailed analysis of the art of seizing and locking, the Method of Chinese Wrestling, a DVD called Standing Grappling, Escapes and Counters, and Traditional Sun Style Taijiquan. Is that the pronunciation?
Taijiquan.
Taijiquan. So we're super excited to be talking about him because he's going to have some really interesting analysis of how the Fremen, who obviously above all things prioritize water discipline, could possibly have been training in the sort of martial arts that led to them being even more deadly in knife fighting, hand-to-hand combat, etc., than the Sardaukar. So that's something that's kind of a bit of a paradox in the book. I want to tee this off real quick with just talking table stakes of what sort of, when we talk about water discipline and the environment of Arrakis where they would have been training as well as fighting would have been. So I have this really cool article. It's kind of a pop science article entitled "This is What Happens to Your Body as You Die of Dehydration" by Claire Maldarelli. And, link will be in the show notes. This article, again, it's pop science, but research help for the story came from Stavros Kavouras, the director of the Hydration Science Labs at Arizona State University. He's an assistant dean, professor of nutrition, a PhD. So I'm pretty sure he knows the science. So there are 4 stages of dehydration, and this article uses the average person at 170 pounds as praxis. So stage 1 is just kind of thirst. That's if you lose like 2% of your body weight, so 3 pounds. You might lose this much sweat by kickboxing for an hour in a hot room. So I think we've all probably kickboxed or done BJJ in a hot room without a drink for an hour. When thirst kicks in, your body clings to all remaining moistures. Your kidneys send less water to your bladder, darkening your urine. As you sweat less, your body temperature rises. Your blood becomes thicker and sluggish. To maintain oxygen level, your heart rate increases. Stage 2 is fainting. So again, 170-pound person, that's 4% of your body weight is 7 pounds. This is like riding a bike for 3 hours in the extreme heat without rehydrating or going without water completely for 2 days. See, the effects are your blood is so concentrated that the resulting decrease in blood flow makes your skin shrivel. Blood pressure drops, making you prone to fainting. You've basically stopped sweating, and without the coolant, you overheat. Stage 3, organ damage. 7% of the body weight of 170 pounds would be 12 pounds. You might lose this much sweat doing hot yoga for 8 hours without hydrating. So we're starting to really get into trouble here. Your body's having trouble maintaining blood pressure. To survive, it slows blood flow to non-vital organs such as kidneys and gut, causing damage. Without your kidneys filtering your blood, cellular waste quickly builds up. You're literally dying for a glass of water. Finally, stage 4, death. 10% of your body weight is 17 pounds for someone who weighs 170. This is like going without water for 5 days, and this is where we talk about training on Arrakis as a military squad, 11 hours in 90-degree heat without rehydrating. So you're basically on death's door here. This is key. If it's hot out, your uncontrollable body temperature means your vital organs risk overheating. Liver failure will probably kill you. But if conditions are mild, toxic sludge builds up in your blood, and your coroner's report will more likely read kidney failure. So that's what happens if you're training without protection or rehydrating out in an environment like Arrakis. So you got to wonder, how did they do it? So
I think there's a general rule of thumb, Mike, that a human being can only last 2 days without water at 120 degrees. And that's without moving at all.
Right.
So, so the recommendation, if you're lost in the desert, is don't hoard your water, drink your water. Right. But anyway, the main thing is 120 degrees, you have to sit down.
Yeah.
And you can only last about 2 days, about 48
Right.
hours.
Right.
But maybe we should just turn it over to Tim. But before we do, I just want to paint a quick picture of the Fremen, how they got there, why they're there. So the Fremen are sort of, unlike the folks that live in the city, the Fremen that live in the Sieges are sort of hidden. They hid themselves from the Harkonnens, and for a fair bit have hidden themselves from House Atreides. So they have sort of mixed into the desert landscape. These Sieges that they live in are typically underground. They probably limit their exposure to the daytime sun as much as possible for a number of reasons, right? They can't be traipsing around in the desert anyway because the worms like to eat them. So they've hidden away in these underground communities where they are holding water however they come by it. There's many ways. And so that's kind of where we find them. And very quickly, they're going to go from these sort of wild desert people to being a trained army who defeats the emperor's Sardaukar, which are highly trained fighters, trained like in the Roman, trained like what's the word, Tim, for the folks who had to go to the arena to fight?
Gladiators?
Yeah. So the Sardaukar are like gladiators. That army is made out of survivors, obviously, right? Because they have to fight each other constantly. So at some point, these two forces collide, and the Fremen are superior. It was like they said it was like 1-3. I'll have to find the exact quote in the book.
And Jeff, weren't they even more lethal than the Sardaukar before Paul Muad'Dib really started to train them, and they just got even better and more organized?
That's right. So these are like the Navy SEALs of the Dune universe, which is quite expansive. They kick everybody's ass, and it's like one Fremen to like 3 to 5 Sardaukar. That's how many they could take out. So probably a smaller force able to deal with overwhelming numbers. So Tim, how could this happen?
Yeah. So we were talking last week about how they would probably train, right?
Yeah.
So you have to, everyone who trains is going to have techniques. They're going to understand tactics, that kind of thing. So you have a group like the Fremen on Dune, right? And they have special circumstances because of their environment. Yeah. And they probably have less access to, they couldn't train a different terrain. You've got to stay probably underground most of the time when you train. You can't be outside. And you need to, above all, they need to not sweat too much. That would be their, the exigencies of being in that environment. You got to learn to fight. So, as far as something like techniques go, you'd assume that there's no magic technique. Everyone in the universe who's in an army is going to understand fundamentally how to do the same kinds of things, right? Mm-hmm. So this is what started our conversation. So what we're talking about was how do you get, first of all, you have to, anyone who's going to fight, there's going to be 2 primary areas. You have to learn, techniques, strategies, tactics. And the other part is you have to condition, because knowing a lot of techniques and even being an organized force, you're still going to lose a fight if you're not strong enough to win, right? Or don't have the endurance to win. All those things the attributes have to be there. So first of all, I would think that I thought was interesting. So you go, okay, you got these people who can't drill like a normal fighting force would. So we're going to say they got to be underground, and they got to conserve. If you don't want to sweat, you can't overexert. Like everyone, it doesn't matter what the temperature is, right? The harder you work out, the more you're going to sweat. So they're going to be super cognizant of that idea. So we started talking about Tai Chi. So in traditional Tai Chi training, now everyone knows it as a calisthenic kind of health art, but it was originally a martial art. Now, I'm going to preface it by saying, obviously, doing things. So Tai Chi's done in slow motion in general. That's what everyone sees, people doing kind of form movements in slow motion.
I think everyone thinks of the scene in Vision Quest where Loudon Swain is delivering, I don't know if you guys remember that obscure movie from the 80s, but he's delivering the room service to the guy, and anyway.
Yeah. So if you learn Tai Chi as a martial art, it's only doing forms in slow motion is really one part of it. It's not the whole system. It's an important part of the system, but there's also conditioning. There's also, of course, full sparring. So, I'm extrapolating it out. So it's just the idea of it. But the question would be, if you could train in slow motion, like moving slowly, you could conserve a lot more energy, of course, than if you're training like rigorously, right? So the question would be, can you learn useful skills that you could apply to a real fight by training in slow motion? And the answer is you can. So In the real world, though, it'd be one part of the system. It wouldn't be the only thing you would do, but it would be something that you could actually do to get better at fighting, right? And how does that work? So your body in general doesn't know the difference in speed; it knows the difference in tension. So if you're moving slow, like a lot of athletic skills, when you first learn them, you break down the movements and you'll do them slowly at first just to learn how to do them correctly, right? Then you'd speed it up. So everyone has a concept of training slowly. So the idea in Taiji is, why do you train slowly? Well, your brain can keep up with what your body's doing. So if you have someone, do any kind of movement, like throw a kick or a punch, and they do it super fast, and you said to them, halfway through that, right when you were stepping, what was your left hand doing? You wouldn't know. It'd be too quick. You'd be like, I can't, my brain can't keep track of everything. But if you did it very slowly, you could. So you're refining your movement, your balance, and all those things by going slowly, at least at first, right? So this would be a legit training method for people who don't want to overexert. That's why Taiji became known as a health art, because if you're older or not in good shape, right, you can modify these kind of things, move slowly, and build up your strength and endurance and all that. So that's a legit training. So I don't know, what the Fremen really did, but you can imagine them drilling precisely slowly. And that would be one thing you could do, right? Instead of rigorously. Now, sometimes you'd have to, in the real world, you'd have to sometimes spar and go fast. But for the most part, we imagine people training, like you mentioned, the Roman legions, right? They said when the Roman legions trained, it looked like a bloodless battle. They were like whacking the shit out of each other with wooden weapons. And, so they were training just like they fought. So that would be a whole different idea of training, to go slow, right? Mm-hmm. And you can even practice wrestling skills and things in slow motion. You know what I mean? As you get good at it. And then the next thing we talked about was building up strength and endurance. So the moving around in slow motion, doing combat movement, would be technical training. If you want attribute training, first of all, you need strength. The stronger you are, the better you are, right? Like I tell my students when we train, one thing I've never, ever heard in all my years of training and competing, I've never heard anyone walk off the mats and say, I would have won that fight. It was a little bit weaker, right? So the stronger you are, the better. So we think of strength training, and now we think about like lifting heavy weights really hard, or, doing violent actions. And a lot of people know about isometric training. It's not as popular as other types of training, but it's been around forever. And it's very popular in kind of Asian traditional martial arts. And the thing about isometrics and we're talking about isometrics, you're using force against an immovable object. So everybody knows, I push my palms together really hard. That's isometrics, right? I could be pushing on a wall or another person. I could be pulling something, but there's no movement. But the thing about isometrics are, you can build up a huge amount of strength in a short amount of time for those ranges of motion with very brief, intense bouts of exercise, right? So say you push with maximum force against a wall for 10 seconds, just once or twice. You can build up a huge amount of strength literally within weeks at that movement, right? So it's good for the martial arts. You pick positions, like a lot of boxing trainers will have you put your jab against the wall and then press your weight into it. So your body becomes very strong at the apex of the jab, right when you connect with the guy's face. So your calorie expenditure is relatively low as compared to isotonic, like moving exercise, right? And you get because it's so brief, there's very little energy used. So you could theoretically do sets of specific isometrics, right? And build up a lot of strength with little, like, metabolic energy use, which translates to you're not going to sweat very much, right?
It's just like the wall presses that we've been doing to strengthen, like pushing and punching, right?
And correct, exactly. So could you do it? I suppose, you could use like wall cables with weights and throw lots of punches against resistance, and all that will make you very strong. It would also expend a lot of energy, and your body temperature was going to go up and you're going to sweat. Yeah. So things like slow motion, practicing of, like, it'd be like shadow boxing slow, right? Paying attention. You could practice grappling drills relatively slowly. You could practice, all kinds of things like that. You could build up strength and muscle endurance with things like isometrics. And all those things are going to build, the attribute side and the skill side without a huge expenditure of energy that would allow, you'd be breathing hard and sweating otherwise, right? And I think that would be the idea of the Fremen. It's like, how do we avoid water loss?
Yeah. Cool.
So that helps to understand how they can build both strength, endurance, and do technical training. But as I found out, in one or two jiu-jitsu competitions. Technical training, even being a little bit stronger, doesn't always equate to a win. So fight experience has to be a big part of this as well, right?
Right. Here's what I'd assume from the books, are like we just talked about. They're probably fighting a lot, like for real fighting anyway, right? So you'd have to have, like in the real world again, you're gonna have sometimes when you have to train hard. You're gonna have to spar hard. Just like, you know, when we do jiu-jitsu, you could roll at a moderate pace and, you know, be in a semi-cooperative kind of mode and practice your techniques, but you can't win tournaments with that. That training's great. It's kind of like being in school. You know, you study, but every 2 weeks you got to take a test. You've got to have some kind of pressure testing, right?
Yeah.
So say you're doing jiu-jitsu and you're saying you're very sensible about training and you want to minimize injury and you want to train. Because here's the thing about jiu-jitsu, just Brazilian jiu-jitsu alone, or for the people listening who've done jiu-jitsu, the more you practice, the better you get. So if say the injury risk is completely taken out of the equation. So we go to class every day and we roll balls out hard, right? Every day, and we never get injured. But even if you're super athletic, you're going to get tired. So Monday, Tuesday, great. Wednesday, your performance is going to decline because you're tired. So now you got to take off 2 days. The other person is training moderately 6 days a week. He will get better at technique. He's just doing it more, right? So the balance is, how do I train to get better at technique, and yet I still have to prepare for a real competition, which is going to be much more intense, right? So the obvious, and there might be other ways to do it, but the obvious answer would be, well, I train at a moderate pace, and then every X amount of time, you know, my partner and I say, now we're going to go hard, tournament hard, for say just a round or two. So you're getting used to the actual pressures of competition, but you're not doing it so much you're getting injured and tired, so you can train more, right? So you'd have to imagine someone like the Fremen, they'd occasionally have to go hard and lose a little water. But I have a feeling that there are a lot of actual real fights. And that's where you would build up, or you would start to understand like what a real fight's like.
Yeah, well, they definitely had one-on-one duels where it was definitely showtime for each other. Yeah. I think what I'm hearing here, and I'll make an analogy, is, you know, the United States military budget is, if I'm not mistaken, like the largest single kind of line item budget in our country's economy. And
it's somewhere above $17.
Yeah, and the idea is sacrifices need to be made.
17 billion.
Yeah, sacrifices need to be made. Like, this is kind of that area where like it just kind of needs to be done. And in terms of like water discipline and all, like, sorry, the kindergarten teacher doesn't get to take a sip of water when his or her throat gets a little parched when they're teaching. But we're going to let some of our warriors sweat and then chug a glass of water, which is like, it just needs to be done. Sorry.
Right.
You know,
so they're going to generate some water with the still suits, right? But yeah, even that is not going to make up for what happens in close hand-to-hand combat.
Especially if they're training in something more like a loincloth or something akin to sort of traditional sort of desert grappling type gear. By the way, I have a nerded out comment here about the still suit. So the still suit, if it's properly set up and you're properly wearing it, you will lose a thimbleful of water a day. I Googled thimbles, and the average thimble appears to be 2 ounces.
Yeah.
A pound of water is 15 ounces. So again, sticking with the 170 pound person, 10 pounds of water loss would be 75 days in the deep desert. You'd be on death's door. So if you made it back to the sitch at day 74, you might get carried into a place where you can get rehydrated, but that's how long you'd last in a still suit. Obviously very different if you're just in a loincloth and you're grappling and stuff.
Well,
Jeff,
so the still suit also that assumes the general Fremen custom of they're not really, it's not like you're lifting weights in it. You're not jogging around the desert or something. You're basically, there's an economy of motion that's assumed. So we can assume that on the battlefield, while the still suit will still perform, you're going to be shedding water probably faster than the suit could potentially hold it. And then you've got a second problem with the still suit, which is that the various pumps and mechanisms that move water into its catch, they all seem to line up with places that knife fighters would want to hit. They're at the heel, it's on the arms, it's at the neck. So they're all very, very close to what traditional targets would be for knife fighting. Which brings me to another point. Tim, knife fighting feels, from my own experience, it feels like it's a fight, but it's like 10 levels more. That
Yeah,
could just be me, but like I feel much more tired. Like when we were doing like disarm or knife control drills, I feel like I'm exerting myself one order of magnitude, maybe more than if I was just dealing with punches.
Yeah, because it's the imminent threat of being killed, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, a fight's dangerous enough. And of course, you can get punched and killed, but if a person has a knife, it's obviously much more. So I would think that, so here's the thing, if people are trained with weapons though, the more you train and the more experience you have, the calmer that's mostly just not being calm. So, think about not having a knife first. So think about when you first started jiu-jitsu and you're a white belt and, you train into school, you kind of get used to rolling, and then your first tournament, how nervous you are.
Oh,
right?
yeah.
It's not life and death, right? It's just rolling, but for a medal. And still, but the more you compete, the calmer you become. You know what I mean? So it'd be the same. It's the same with all soldiers too. That, like they say, if a soldier survives his first firefight, he's 100% more likely to survive his second one just because he's calmer. So that would probably be how that went. You train long enough and you have enough experience, and then you calm down. But we all know realistically too, no one's going to be in an actual battle situation or even a street fight and be calm. You're always going to be. It's like Mike said. You got to assume that when you're really in war or whatever, your water supply is gonna go down, right? People are gonna use more water.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I wanted to talk a little bit. I think we just have a little bit of time left, but I wanted to talk a little bit about what the Fremen fighting style might be like. So just to give some background here, Frank Herbert fashioned the Fremen after sort of Bedouin desert people, but he was also focused on the San people, which are the first people from South Africa. Anyway, and then the third place that he was informed was by the Chechens, specifically Imam Shamil's army that successfully fought off the Russians for quite a while in like between 1834 and 1859. So that was a very knife-centric culture, shared some religious aspects with the Fremen. These were like badass dudes living in a very difficult place. So you've got this sort of mix of desert culture and then this sort of radical, well, let me rephrase. Then you have this mix of sort of desert culture, African and Middle Eastern, but then you also have this sort of Chechen, like mountain people. And this is where most of the knife rituals, ceremonies, and beliefs, as well as fighting style, comes from. So if you've got a very knife-centric, and then sort of a religious and also like the South, right? Fremen could take exception pretty quickly and it would turn almost immediately into a duel. Mm-hmm. So in a culture like that, what is a fight going to look like?
When you fight with a bladed weapon, it's hard for most people to actually stab someone with a knife. So, from military training, like in World War II, the statistics, there were very few very close encounters when they fought with bayonets. And in general, no one ever stabbed anyone. It was very difficult. Killing at a distance is the proximity idea, right? The closer you are to someone, the harder it is to kill them unless you're some kind of psycho, right? Mm-hmm. So it's easier to drop a bomb or use a drone than it is to shoot a guy you can see. It's much easier to shoot someone in kind of the far distance if you can't see them. And then when you're face to face with bayonets, no one wants to kill anyone in general. So it would take a fair amount of training, to have people comfortable with the idea of actually stabbing each other. Now, you would punch a guy in the face if you're mad, but you don't expect to kill him. So to actually put a knife into his body would be. So those kind of cultures are almost always pretty fierce macho kind of, and they usually come from, places where, it's a hard life kind of thing. They're usually that kind of, it's only certain kind of cultures tend to be knife. It's actually easier to stab someone with a sword at a distance than a knife when they do psyche. So you'll have all that in mind. So you'd imagine that it would take probably a lot of it will be a cultural thing where if you're raised with it, you're kind of raised with these ideas, and then you start training very young. Like think of a samurai kind of culture where you're raised as a samurai. You start training very young. They get used to weapons, or something like the Spartans where they made the young boys go with them on a campaign and then kind of sit on a hill and watch the carnage. So they just get used to it. When you're raised like that, it becomes probably much easier to be good at it, once you start training. And then the actual training would be like any other, you train with mock weapons probably and that kind of thing. And just get used to it.
Is this where there's that I don't know if legend's the right term, possible let's just stick with the reality. I've heard that when you're in the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, they give you a kitten and you have to treat, like, you have to like raise it like it's your own for 6 weeks or 6 months or something, and then on test day you have to be able to kill it yourself. And the idea is you have to be able to be that close to something and then kind of violently kill it to be able to kind of move on to that next level. Is that the sort of things that, first, I don't know if that's actually true, but I've heard that many times. But certainly it sounds like it might be an effective way of what's the word?
Tim, we know someone who had military training, like as a field medic, and they were given a goat to care for, a live goat. Mm-hmm. And then during live round training, they had to use the goat becomes their shield, right?
Yeah.
Which is not exactly the same thing as killing. Well, it is the same thing.
It's one step back from killing a kitten.
Yeah.
Sorry, not to go off on some weird tangent, but my dad was a dog handler during Vietnam, and the dog that traveled with him did not come back for the same reason. My dad was shot at by a sniper, and the dog became my father's cover. Mm. So there's got to be that element of like just willingness to go from we're cool. Like, I kind of think of the South, like the old South, and the sort of the politeness of the South that we see now is really an artifact of an extremely violent culture where you would be in a duel in 2 seconds if you caused even the slightest offense. Do I have that right, Tim?
Yeah, I don't know as much about this. I know the armed society is a polite society idea, right? So, people are much more polite when they're not the only only person that's armed. So that's probably true. But and also people who hunt have a lot easier time traditionally with killing up close. You know what I mean? Like hunt in the traditional sense, not with maybe a high-powered rifle from hundreds of yards, but they get used to killing and seeing it.
Hunter-gatherers, you mean?
Yeah, or just people that actually hunt animals. So back in the day, you shoot something with a bow and arrow, then you chase it down and you slit its throat, right? So you're used to like killing another. I mean, like the average person now, even if you ate meat or whatever, you really wouldn't want to see something slaughtered. It goes again, you're kind of like, wow, that's gross. Mm-hmm. But imagine you had to hunt and kill it with your own, you grow up with it. So you get used to that kind of thing.
Yeah. There's some really, in the guns, germ, steel sense of the term, there's some really interesting stuff about hunter-gatherer societies and some of the sacrifices they make that we don't think of, like the number of, I guess you call them abortions, and then also the number of babies that are just kind of left on the trail, because if you're a hunter-gatherer, you're limited to what you can carry as opposed to a civilized society. So those are some of the day-to-day aspects of, I think the term I was looking for before was desensitizing, but these are all things that in modern urban context seem repugnant to us, but they become a normal aspect of survival in those types of societies, which, if I'm not mistaken, Jeff, aren't the San technically hunter-gatherers?
Yeah.
They're not okay.
That's right. Yep.
Right. Jeff,
so speaking of the San, I just wanted to get to so the core of my question was really about what would the fight look like mechanically. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about standing, grappling, throwing, avoiding having some part of your body pierced.
So knife fights. So standing wrestling was the foundation of all ancient battlefield training everywhere. So in Asia, in Europe, you learn to wrestle first, and then you learn how to use a weapon in general. And the idea was, you might be in formation, you might dress a line, have a shield wall and the whole, but sooner or later you get close, right? When you're very close, once you get into like kind of that version of hand-to-hand combat, even with not so maybe spears and things, but even with swords, you're going to be grabbing each other all the time, right?
Yeah.
And with knives especially. So standing wrestling doesn't mean that, you're going to drop your knife and wrestle with the guy and try to pin him. The idea is when you're in that close of quarters, so you have a free movement range of fighting when no one's touching anybody, you're free to move, right? Like you're kickboxing at a distance. Once you're close enough to make contact, they can influence your balance with their grips or wherever they have contact, right? So now, even if you want to stab someone to death, you have to be able to out wrestle him, because you got to be able to keep your balance, take him off balance. You got to be able to control his knife arm. So if you look at most traditional wrestling styles in the world that start standing up, they start in an over-under grip. Yeah. You have one arm wrapped over say my left arm wrapped over your right arm, and your left arm's wrapped over my right arm. So the fundamental grip of sumo after the, the initial clash. They go to that grip. You start like that with back hold wrestling styles all over the world. You clasp your arms behind their back and that. Why? Because the guy has a weapon in his right arm. You've wrapped it into your armpit so he can't stab you with it. He's done the same thing, and that's where the fight starts. So when you look at almost worldwide traditional stand-up wrestling styles, they start in some version of that. For Glima does, and with the Norse wrestling, or you look at Shiram in Korea, they all start in that position, and that's why it's a remnant of battlefield wrestling. So everyone's trying to control the other guy's weapon arm and then throw him on the ground and kill him, or free their arm and kill him with their weapon, right? So I would guess, my fighting on Arrakis would be no different. You know what I mean? Everyone's going to have standing grappling skill. They're going to try to immobilize the guy's weapon arm and then kill him with their weapon or throw him on the ground. Once you're thrown on the ground as well, the standard is Neon Belly and Jiu-Jitsu. It doesn't matter if you look at, that's Japanese oriented originally. Chinese, most battlefield martial arts in Europe as well. Kneeling on someone who's down is the dominant position to kill with a weapon. You're not committed to ground fighting. You're not rolling around on the ground where anyone else can run up on you. You can get up quickly, and yet you have your body weight on the guy long enough to stab him in the throat or, whatever you're going to do. So I would imagine, if you look at every human culture that's had battlefield, war, they all do the same thing. So it would look like that, pretty much.
Yeah.
When you said they start, do you mean in the sport versions, they literally they assume that position and then the ref says go?
Exactly.
Or after the openings? Oh, interesting.
Well,
there's two styles.
Also early training, right, Tim? That would be the evolution of training under someone who had been in combat, right?
Right. And Mike's question is, most of the styles literally start there. You start with those grips.
Yeah.
And then some styles like sumo, you start from a distance. The tachiya, you clash together, and then everybody looks for the grip. Everybody wants inside control, just like wrestling.
Right.
I won't let you get both in. So we end up with 1 over 1 under. But things like,
pummel.
if you look at Korean wrestling, right? You start on your knees. You have a belt you grab, and you wrap up in an over under, then you stand up and wrestle. So, and then there's back hold wrestling, like in Scotland or something. It's over under and you clasp your hands behind each other's back. So most of the styles worldwide, you literally start there because they're like, before this position, we're just stabbing each other. We don't have to worry about that. Once we get to close quarters, here's what's going to really happen. And that's what we practice from.
Right.
Yeah.
It's like the positional drill in training turned into the beginning of how we would do it as a sport with medals and stuff. Yeah.
Correct. And it's a position that everybody went to automatically.
Right.
So, you think of pummeling.
Referee's position in American wrestling in between, when you go into the second round and stuff like that, second and third, quarter of the match.
Yeah. That's a little different because you have a dominant position on the ground. Right.
Oh,
so
right.
Yeah. You have a downed wrestler and the wrestler on its back,
but
same idea. But they're going to start in some version of an over under. And you look at Greco-Roman wasn't really what the Greeks, the French invented it, but it was supposedly based on what ancient kind of Greek and Roman fighting, which of course came from the battlefield. And that's why you pummel. Everybody wants inside control to dominate the balance, and you end up with 1 over 1 under. So this is literally, what's going to happen. It doesn't matter. If you're a humanoid and you're fighting with a knife, you're going to, that's how it's going to end up. And then the off balancing and throwing is if you can throw them on their back and drop your knee on them, you have gravity and leverage on your side. You have a lot better chance of stabbing someone to death.
So it's going to look, to compare it to sort of martial arts that we have in the world today, we can imagine it's going to look a little bit like, I think we talked about Dambe, we talked about Lam, which is Senegalese wrestling. Also, same idea, right? There's whether they have a weapon or not, one hand is turned into one. Like in Dambe, they wrap that arm and it becomes a club. So
instead of a knife, so no one dies. That's the idea.
Exactly, yeah.
So you go back far enough. If boxing, as we know it, well, boxing in general, everywhere, originated in general, not just crude, kids slugging it out, but with technique where you have a lead hand and you have your power hand's back, right? So if you look at ancient Greek boxing, that evolved from weapons fighting. Your lead hand was where you had a shield, and your rear hand was where you had a weapon. So if you look at kind of like pancration box, things that evolved out of the Greeks when they really had an actual style of boxing, your left hand covered and your right hand pummeled, right? And that's your left hand would have a shield and your right hand would have a sword or a knife or a spear. So, that's, you put a glove. So in the modern world, you say, okay, my left hand covers and I'm just going to punch you with my big right glove so that, I can dominate and win the fight and maybe knock you out, but I'm not going to stab you to death. Yeah. So, you don't kill your people.
Yeah, the couple times I've suited up and done sword and shield kind of stick fighting, it is super fun and effective to use the shield as just a giant fist.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Very
The
common.
lead hand bashing him back and covering, and the other hand killing.
Yeah.
Right.
All right. Tim, I want to be conscious of your time. So
Yeah.
thank you very, very much.
Oh yeah, my pleasure.
Can we have you back again if we need to go deeper?
Well, sure. Yeah.
Yeah, there's
Sure.
gonna be
You guys are the experts.
there's gonna be more of a pitched battle with multiple people. So talking about group formations could be a future topic, because we've kind of talked a lot about the dual aspect of it. Let's imagine when it's maybe 4 or 5 Fremen maybe back to back and surrounded by Sardaukar or something like that.
Also, Tim, if you read the book when you were studying in Taiwan, did you read it did you read it in English or in Chinese?
No, I read it in English.
Oh, in English.
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't even know.
Right.
Yeah, I read it in English. No, it was, you know, I like science fiction. It's like probably most people read Dune. It's just so good, right? It had a big like impact on me just from the whole world of it, you know, all the aspects of it. So yeah, I'm not an expert like you guys, but I'm a big fan.
Cool.
Well, thank you very, very much.
Yeah, guys, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it. It was fun.
Really appreciate it.
Awesome.
All right. Thanks, guys.
You know, one thing we keep circling back on is the concept, and I guess this will be my last comment for the episode, is we keep circling back to this idea of what in sociology is called honor culture versus dignity culture. Yep. And the Fremen have a strong honor culture where any slight against them, they feel the need to defend their honor. Whereas, and I think sociologists have largely debated or you know, what have you, the idea that Enlightenment values like democracy or increased participation in the economy or politics, or you know, the ability to vote, is what leads to more of like a dignity culture where it's assumed you have dignity and you don't have to, like, you know there's that Chris Rock joke of you shooting someone in the theater because they snubbed your puma, right? You don't have to defend your honor so aggressively when you are assumed to just have dignity, and you guys can apologize or, oh, sorry man, it's cool, you know, that kind of thing. So
yeah, I think Herbert intentionally, so he doesn't talk about it directly.
No, right.
But by dragging the Chechen culture from that time in.
Absolutely an honor culture. And that's also what Tim meant by machismo too. I mean, when we look at what machismo type cultures are, a lot of it's just another word for honor culture.
Exactly.
Honor culture is the fancy word for machismo in a lot of ways.
Yeah. I mean, the whole reference to the South, I think, is really fitting.
Scots Irish honor culture.
Oh, yeah, exactly. Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah. There is a Western philosopher, younger philosopher, who just wrote a book. He also does a podcast. Give me a second.
Sure.
But he wrote a fascinating book on honor culture, and I just want to remember what his name is. He's got a great podcast as well.
I'd probably like to check that out.
Yeah. But just sticking with this note, I'll find his name and we can include it in the show notes. But there's a great paper, it's called The Honor Culture, or The Culture of Honor, The Psychology of Violence in the South, that really discusses this. The fact that so this is definitely true in as far as we understand Fremen culture from the books. Mm-hmm. The idea that you could have to defend yourself at any particular moment for any reason, even amongst people who had been your friends. So like a change of attitude or a departure from existing norms could result in you having to fight to the death.
Right.
So that idea creates a situation where you're probably always alert. Right. Which, as I was thinking about like pit fighting, pit fighting is like sport fighting in a way. I mean, the consequences are much higher,
right?
But you train for the performance, then you make the performance, then you rest, then you go back into a training cycle. Whereas I think psychologically, Fremen were constantly primed, just ready for a potential fight and ready to throw down.
Right.
There was this idea that although it gets violated many times in the books, this idea that if you draw your crysknife, it needs to be blooded before it's returned to its sheath.
Right.
So if a fight is on, if you've expended that energy, there's a lot of energy lost once you decide that you're going to fight, right? blood rushes away from your head, rushes to your limbs, blah,
Right.
blah, blah,
Right.
The amygdala is fully driving. So right away you get that adrenaline dump.
Yeah.
So I think that idea is if it's go time, it's go time.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which, nowadays we talk it over.
I mean, isn't that with also just the general sense of, I'm from Ohio originally, so conceal and carry is something a lot of people have. The idea is you never pull out your gun to show someone you mean business.
They should know that you mean business.
Right.
Before the gun comes out.
Right. I mean, that's just the general training is you only remove it if it's like absolute life and death, and you need to, you're going to use it as soon as you pull it out. So
yeah. So the South, people living below the Mason-Dixon line, this is fascinating.
Right.
There's a lot to go into here, but basically there is not a huge difference in homicide rates between white and black folks in these areas. This is interesting because in other parts of the US, that is the case. And there's a lot to discuss there. I'm not really trying to crack into that.
Right.
But the core belief around why that is the case in the South is because they're still carrying this sense of honor culture.
Yeah.
And it still goes on today.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well,
Numbers
the
lower,
Appalachians systematically disenfranchised from access to resources, healthcare, et cetera. The opioid pandemic is clearly in those regions more. I mean, it's disenfranchised in the exact same way we talk about other non-privileged people, and consequently leads to similar trends in crime and other lifestyle type of things. So yeah. Absolutely.
So it ends up being a 3-part deal. It's the honor culture,
right,
an ethic of self-protection,
right,
and then the widespread presence of weapons. So meaning the knowledge that most people, or potentially all people in your environment, are armed.
Mm-hmm.
So one way to look at it is this is causal to a cycle of violence. The other way to think about it is that violence is a fact.
Mm-hmm.
And that creates like an attenuation to it.
Right.
I don't think the modern South is anything like Fremen culture, but
I don't think so.
But we're probably getting a peek at what that's
right.
like.
Right. Speaking of my final comment for myself is my favorite form of the if it's out you need to use it is the speaking of the Chris knife is the equivalent with the drinking horn.
Yes.
Once it's full of delicious mead or ale, you don't put it down. Nope. You got to drink it. And then that's it. No putting down your drinking horn.
That's right.
Yeah.
Right. So if the knife comes out, it's stabby, stabby. Right. If the drink comes out, it's drinky, drinky.
That's right.
I like the simplicity of that. It would make my life in some ways certainly more dangerous.
Right.
But in other ways, easier. Like
right.
I'm a simple man. I need to know what's going on.
Yeah. A glass that you can't put down. Perfect.
Well, all right. Well, that was amazing. I think there's probably a lot deeper we could go there. But I think the last thing I'd like to say just about this content in general is that while I think you did a great job of introducing Tim, I think one of the main qualifications, so Tim has been teaching internal martial arts for something like 30 years. So internal martial arts are martial arts that focus on the generation of whole body power. And so Taiji is one of those. Or there's maybe a family that have a similar look and feel to Taiji, although they have different martial applications.
Yeah.
He is somewhat of an expert on how to generate more power than your opponent through like correct body alignment and posture. And
I don't know about this, but is this
by
like
him literally across the room?
Is this, I don't know about this stuff much. Is this sort of that when you heard Bruce Lee talk about like the finger knockout or the one finger punch or what have you?
Probably there's a component. It's actually more like when Hickson talks about invisible jujitsu. What he's talking about are, having a superior angle on your opponent, understanding where force is generated. So there's a couple ways that you could throw a punch. Like one is like I throw my fist at my opponent, or I push from my shoulder and I push my arm into my opponent.
Right.
What I would say I work on with Tim when we're working on striking is actually hip alignment, posture, and footwork. because the force for a powerful punch. So I'm not bragging, but when I started hitting, it just hurt my hand, and the bag didn't move very far. I think what Tim has taught me, the way that I see it, is like when I hit my training dummy, poor Bob, or when I hit a bag now, like the bag will fold a little. It doesn't fold completely. Like I don't want to, but I can put some weight into it, or I can put some force into it. Most of that force comes from blocking my hip. Right? It doesn't come from over rotation. It comes from stopping the rotation and letting the force out.
Right.
So there's a lot to talk about here, but that's basically it. Like probably his biggest contribution to martial arts is only understood by a small number of fighters. I can't claim to understand it completely, but you see a number of fighters like, oh, what is her name? She's been killing it in the UFC. Chinese.
What are kind of her? Yeah. The one who gave what? Wow, we're bad with names. We're just gonna say what's her face. She gave the what's her face the huge hematoma on her head.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Let me look up her name so that we can fix this part.
While you're looking that up, I don't think Tim knew the Vision Quest reference. So real quick, Vision Quest was like a mid-'80s wrestling movie, one of the only wrestling movies ever made where...
I know the movie, yeah.
Oh, I know you do. But for the audience, Matthew Modine, who is in Stranger Things more recently, but definitely had a storied career, turned down being Maverick in Top Gun. There's a scene where he delivers food, takeout or room service. He's a room service kind of food delivery person in a hotel. He delivers food to this guy Kevin who's doing Tai Chi, and Kevin makes a move on him and it's really awkward and he runs out of the room. Anyway, he was doing Tai Chi. That's
So the fighter is Zhang.
Right?
Zhang Weilei. She definitely has this sense. There's actually a handful of fighters.
Jacek, I think is who. Yeah.
There's been a couple of MMA fighters who've come from an internal martial arts background. Now, when they fight, they're not. You wouldn't see anything that looks like Tai Chi. You're going to see them using all the same basic techniques. So there's going to be jiu-jitsu, there's going to be Western boxing, there's going to be Thai boxing, and probably kicks from karate in various styles. What they take from their internal martial arts training, though, is how to generate power by using their whole body, by using structural alignment and balance. A similarly trained fighter without the understanding of those internal principles, very different. So the best way to explain that is if you look at Hickson and how he just stands out completely from the Gracie pack.
Yeah.
Right. He understands these principles. I think his ability to articulate them is something else, but he definitely understands them and puts them to work. And like anyone who trains with him or listens to him talk about effective jiu-jitsu, or just watching him in Pride, you can see the benefit. So the techniques themselves, not very fancy. He's got a small set of things that he does all the time.
Right.
But that's not to suggest that those techniques are the things that are finishing the fight for him. He's able to use such a basic repertoire because he has the principles locked down pretty tightly.
Right. Okay, Jeff, so that was awesome. That brings us to the end of our bonus Patreon only episode with Tim Cartmell. I think just a quick summary of what we went over. The Fremen obviously have a strong honor culture. They needed to train in ways to really avoid sweating. So things like isometrics could really have built up a lot of strength without expending a lot of energy and thus water. Slow training would have been a way of building up repetitive ability in their techniques. Obviously, they probably still have some sort of a go time where they had to give up a little bit more water than the average activity was allowed in the sitch. But, it was for obviously the defense of the community, and it was considered obviously that's more important. In terms of once they got into these one-on-one combat situations, a lot of what we see in modern battlefield wrestling is what you're going to see in these knife fights, where what you're trying to do is make sure that you're controlling the arm of your opponent that is holding the knife, and you obviously want to maneuver your knife arm to be in its best position. They're probably trying to do the same. Ultimately, when you end up in the ground, the point isn't to roll around, it's to take control of the position. Something like holding your opponent down with your knee on their sternum or belly is going to obviously pin them to the ground, and you're going to have the best chance of getting your stabby kill shot in from there. And so we have some cool factoids about hydration and about the still suits. But I think, as you pointed out astutely, the still suit obviously easily damaged because a lot of the places where the water is going to flow from and to in a still suit is going to be a prime target for a knife in that type of situation. So I wouldn't be surprised if people actually were fighting in a still suit and then found themselves, they won the fight but dead in the desert a couple days later. So that might just also be the reality of Arrakis as well.
I think that would absolutely be. It's interesting, I've been looking at people's ideas on the Chris knife. So what might it have looked like?
Right.
And almost uniformly, it's presented as a single blade with a point.
Right.
Which I find very hard to believe. I think in an image that I saw from the upcoming film, I had something that looked very much like a military K-bar. So double bladed with a point. And I think that's got to be absolutely the way. In order to achieve an economy of motion, you would almost require that the weapon be sharp on both sides, as well as a point. Slicing probably the key.
Right.
Much more than stabbing. I mean, stabbing has a place, but probably much more slicing than stabbing.
Right.
Yeah. They're also cool. We should
hopefully that we didn't just
buy one and give it away.
Yeah.
This doesn't come up in our covering of the book for quite a while, but this was intended to be a bonus episode for our Patreon supporters. And we thought, why don't we actually get a sense of whether this is the kind of thing that is, one, interesting to people in general, and two, if we did more things like this, is this what would help motivate or inspire people to become patrons? If so, we'd love to hear that. Because we are making this available to the public. And if not, we're just as interested, if not more interested, in hearing what are the kinds of things that will make someone go from a listener to being a patron. And we will absolutely look to burn some calories into delivering that kind of content as well. But we want to get it out there now, and we want to see what people think about it. So we're super happy that you're tuning in. Decode Dune. We have the Facebook community, Decode Dune on Facebook. And then we have an email, decodedune@gmail.com. You can pop over to any of the places where you find us, and it'll be in the show notes over there. So it would be definitely great to get some feedback, and thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.
Like and subscribe wherever you listen to this podcast. And to hear more readings, become a Patreon supporter at Patreon.com/Decode Podcast.